Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation, featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 807 for February 23rd, 2020. Coming up in a few minutes.
I'm good at it, and I think that it truly is in my blood, it's in my lineage. What my great-great-grandfather started, I am privileged to continue on.
I was in Seattle this week for the World Whisky Forum being held at Westland Distillery. But before I left town on the red-eye flight home Thursday night, I caught up with Victoria Eady-Butler. She's the great-great-granddaughter of Nathan Nearest Green, the slave who taught Jack Daniel how to make whiskey, then went to work with him as a free man after the Civil War ended. Uncle Nearest Whiskey is named in Nearest Green's honor, and last summer, Victoria Eady-Butler was named the master blender for Uncle Nearest. This week, she's putting together the fourth batch of Uncle Nearest 1884 small batch whiskey. She'll join me later on WhiskyCast in depth, and I'll have highlights from the World Whisky Forum as well, along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, behind the label, and much more, all on this edition of WhiskyCast.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. The online auction site Whiskey Auctioneer has wrapped up the first half of its auction for the collection amassed by the late Richard Gooding of Colorado. The Perfect Collection auction, as it's being billed, brought in around $4.3 million in bids, including what's believed to be the first $1 million bid ever in an online whiskey auction. One of the 12 bottles of the Macallan 1926 Fine and Rare Valerio Adami edition went for £825,000, or about $1,067,000 at current exchange rates. There is some argument over whether that qualifies as a record or not. Whiskey Auctioneer claims yes, since that price does not include any fees or bidder premiums. The last time an Adami bottle went on the block was in October of 2018 in a live auction at Bonham's in Hong Kong. It brought a high bid of £848,750 with all fees and premiums included. The current overall record remains a £1.45 million price for another Macallan 1926 Fine and Rare bottle set last October at Sotheby's in London. That record could potentially be broken in the second half of the Perfect Collection auction, when yet another one of the 40 1926 Macallans will be on the block. Online bidding begins April 10th. Meanwhile, the oldest ever Irish whiskey collection has been unveiled in Dublin. Irish Distillers has launched the Middleton Very Rare Silent Distillery Collection with the first of 6 annual releases. The first release comes from 1974, just a year before the old Middleton Distillery was closed after the modern Middleton Distillery opened. This is the first release of an Old Middleton whiskey in 16 years. It's a 45-year-old single malt made with peated barley and matured in a third fill sherry cask. Only 48 bottles will be available. The price tag, €35,000 or $40,000 each. The remaining releases will all be between 45 and 50 years old, with one coming each year until 2025. That year marks not only 50 years since the original Middleton Distillery closed in 1975, but 200 years since it opened way back in 1825. One other note out of Ireland. Back in December of 2015, we were on hand when Waterford Distillery fired up its stills for the first time. The wait is almost over now for the first Waterford single malts. The distillery has scheduled an open day on April 25th and has indicated that its first release will come in early May. We'll keep you posted as more details are available. Turning now to Australia, where the Overeem family is getting its name back. Casey Overeem founded his family's distillery in Kingston, Tasmania in 2007, but sold it to Australian Whisky Holdings when he retired. Overeem's production was moved to a shared facility with Lark Distillery in Hobart after that, but Casey's daughter Jane and her husband Mark Sauford decided to open their own distillery on the same site as her father's original distillery. Now, Australian Whisky Holdings has agreed to sell back the Overeem brand name and its existing whiskey stocks to the Saufords. The deal is expected to close this June. In other news now, ending whiskey tariffs were on the agenda this week, not in Washington or Brussels, but in Louisville, as the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States held its first-ever industry-wide conference. Last time around, we reported on the economic impact of the 25% U.S. tariff imposed in October on imports of single malts from Scotland and Northern Ireland, along with the European Union's 25% tariff on American whiskeys. Here's one exchange at the conference between Discus CEO Chris Swanger and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky.
We know you have talked to the President quite a bit on the tariffs and the challenges and your concerns as it relates to that.
With mixed success.
Yeah, he's headstrong.
Trump administration officials decided last week to not increase the single malt whiskey tariff or add more whiskeys from around Europe to the list for now. The U.S. and European Union leaders are trying to resolve their differences that led to the start of the trade dispute nearly 2 years ago. On a happier note from the Discus Conference, Wild Turkey's Jimmy Russell was honored with the Chairman's Leadership Award Tuesday night. That's the highest honor the trade association presents. Sazerac Chairman Bill Goldring was named the Lifetime Achievement Award winner, while the Dave Pickerel Memorial Craft Member of the Year Award went to Philip McDaniel of Florida's St. Augustine Distillery. Kentucky Congressman John Yarmouth was presented with the Top Shelf Award, which goes to a legislator or public official for outstanding support of the spirits industry. Meanwhile, whiskey makers from Japan, Australia, Europe, and North America gathered at Seattle's Westland Distillery for the 2020 World Whisky Forum. It's not your traditional industry conference. The overall goal was to explore innovation, especially when it comes to grain and the other raw materials that go into the whiskey-making process. The conference included a field trip to the Skagit Valley north of Seattle, where there's a lot of work being done to develop small-scale malting technology at Skagit Valley Malting, and experiments with barley and other grains at the Washington State University Extension Campus. World Whisky Forum co-founder Jan Groth was pleased with the decision to bring the conference to North America for the first time.
Going here to Seattle for me as a founder of World Whisky Forum it was a thrill, really good. I'm really happy.
But this is the first time you've brought it out of Europe after the first two were in Sweden and England. What were you expecting when you came over here?
I think that I relied a lot of the knowledge and the passion from Matt Hoffman and Westland Distillery. They've been around the first two actually. So I rely on them and their knowledge, what the forum was all about. So I didn't expect more than to know more about American business and especially single malt. That was very interesting to know.
When's the next one coming and where's it going to be?
Well, it's going to be summer next year. So it's June next year, and I'm very sure it's going to be Europe again. Can't tell you now where it's going to be, but I know it. I need a few paperwork first before it's actually settled, so it's not 100%, but I'm quite sure I know we're going to do it.
We'll have some more highlights from the forum later in this episode and on upcoming episodes of WhiskeyCast. And full disclosure, I was at the forum this week as a guest of Westland Distillery, but as always, full editorial control over our coverage remains with WhiskeyCast. Beam Suntory celebrated another milestone this week at the Jim Beam Distillery in Claremont, Kentucky, with the filling of the 16 millionth barrel of bourbon since the end of Prohibition. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear was on hand for the ceremony, which comes as Jim Beam kicks off a year celebrating what company executives have billed as, quoting now, the brand's 225th anniversary. However, history buffs will recall that generations of Beams never used the family's name on their whiskeys. Colonel Jim Beam himself was known for making Old Tub bourbon back before Prohibition. The Jim Beam name itself didn't go on a bottle until after he rebuilt his distillery in 1935. So we asked Beam Suntory to explain. The official company line is that since Jacob Beam sold his first bottle of whiskey back in 1795, it's the anniversary of the family brand. And yes, they said that with a straight face and a winking emoji, too. Just down the road in Bardstown, Lux Row Distillers is reviving a historic brand from Kentucky bourbon's past. The Daviess County Distilling Company opened back in 1874, survived Prohibition but later closed down. Lux Row owner Luxco acquired the rights to the Daviess County brand many years ago, and it's now releasing 3 new bourbons under that label, with a straight bourbon, a French oak finish, and a Cabernet Sauvignon finish. Ardbeg has let the details on its annual limited edition release out of the barn. If you've ever visited or seen photos of Isla, you've probably noticed the place is crawling with sheep, and that's the theme behind this year's release. It's Ardbeg Black, with 3 A's, as Ardbeg's David Blackmore explained.
So it's the 20th anniversary of the Ardbeg Committee, and we thought we wanted to do something extra special. And, Ardbeg Committee members are all interesting characters, most of them. They're all over the world, so, something a little bit out of the ordinary. And we thought we'd go as far away from Scotland as we could to the place that's most like Scotland. Has the same number of very, very scared sheep, I think, as well, to New Zealand. And we have utilised some New Zealand Pinot Noir red wine barrels to age some Ardbeg. And the results are spectacular. Really rich, inky notes in this whiskey.
And the committee version will go on sale very soon, obviously, and then the regular version after Ardbeg Day.
Sorry, the committee version, yes, in about a month's time, and then the regular version for Ardbeg Day, end of May, beginning of June.
What are you guys planning for Ardbeg Day this year?
If I told you that, it wouldn't be any fun. Lots of fun things happening at the distillery and around the world. A couple of things in the States maybe, but we're kind of concentrating more back at the distillery for 2020 with the 20th anniversary.
Ardbeg Black will go on sale to committee members March 1st, and the regular version will go on sale on Ardbeg Day during the Isla Festival on May 30th. There's no word yet on pricing. Enough of that now. We got updates this week on several whiskey events of note. First, the wonderful World of Whisky show coming up at the end of March in Cornwall, Ontario at the NAV Centre. If you've been reading the news in Ontario, the NAV Centre is currently being used as a quarantine facility for 152 Canadian coronavirus patients evacuated from a cruise ship in Japan. However, the NAV Center's Ian Bentley has confirmed to us via email that the whiskey event will not be affected, since the quarantine period is only for 2 weeks. At last report, none of the quarantined Canadians has tested positive for the COVID-19 novel coronavirus. Meanwhile, Royal Mile Whiskies announced this week the tickets for its annual Whiskey Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, Scotland, will go on sale March 10th. The event is scheduled for August 7th through the 9th. Tickets for the Spirit of Speyside Festival went on sale this past Wednesday, and high demand uncovered some technical problems with the festival's online ticketing system. The problems have now been thrashed out. There's a new events and tickets page available for the more than 700 different events scheduled during the festival. It runs from April 29th through May 4th. And finally, we mentioned the Aussie Spirit Auction in the news back in episode 803. Distillers in Australia have joined forces to raise money for rural aid, which is helping farming communities that were hurt by the recent wildfires. Their online auction ends at the end of this week and has already raised more than $25,000 in bids. The benefit and live auction is set for this coming Friday night in Sydney, and tickets are still available. We have a link for more details in our show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. That's also where you can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Larceny Bourbon's heritage goes back to the days when Treasury Agent John E. Fitzgerald was patrolling the rickhouses of Kentucky, not just for the feds, but also for himself. Seems he was stealing a taste or two out of some of his favorite barrels of wheated bourbon on the side. Today's award-winning Larceny Bourbon has that same soft, smooth character Fitzgerald loved. Look for 92 proof Larceny Bourbon at your local retailer, and be on the lookout for the new limited edition release of Larceny Barrel Proof. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. A couple of reminders now. There is still time to nominate your whiskey club to be our next Whiskey Club of the Month. Each month we honor a whiskey club somewhere in the world. This month's winner was the Morgantown Whiskey Guild in Morgantown, West Virginia. Each winning club receives 24 Whiskey Cast Glencairn glasses to use at their club tastings. It's easy to enter. Just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us and tell us a bit about your club. So far this month, we've heard from, just to name a few, the Whiskey Tasters in Montreal, Maui Malts in Hawaii, and the Whiskey Club Mexico. By the way, if you have nominated your club before, there's no need to get in touch with us again. We do carry over the entries from month to month. We'll announce the March Whiskey Club of the Month next time around, and thanks to Glencairn Crystal for helping us support whiskey clubs all over the world. I'm getting excited about heading to New Zealand in a few days for Whiskey Galore's Dramfest 2020 in Christchurch, coming up the weekend of March 7th and 8th. Our old friend Dave Broom is a Dramfest regular, and when I saw him this week at the World Whisky Forum in Seattle, I asked him to give us a preview.
Dave Broom, you've been to Dramfest every time it's happened practically. What am I in for when I get to Christchurch next week?
You're in for an absolute ball. Just one of the friendliest cities, one of the friendliest whiskey shows. Lovely masterclasses, top-end masterclasses. A lot of the New Zealand distilleries are going to be exhibiting there, and there seems to be more of them every year. A really engaged and committed audience as well, and a lot of fun, and a bit of rum as well. So yeah, it's great, and it's almost like it's a little kind of gang of folk who always end up going there. So it's great to catch up with all the guys from Springbank, Anthony from Kilhoman, my dear friend Mr. McLean. So it's going to be great.
And they're going to have the New Zealand premiere of the Amber Light down there too.
Yeah, I didn't want to blow my own trumpet, but yes, New Zealand premiere of the film on the Friday night. So, yeah, that's going to be really, really good. Yeah.
Have booking agents been ringing your phone off the hook, trying to represent you now that you've been in a movie?
I couldn't possibly say so.
If you're going to be in Christchurch that weekend, tickets are still available for the American Whiskey Tasting I'll be leading on Friday, March 6th at the Carlton Bar and Eatery. I've posted links for tickets on our social media feeds and at the WhiskeyCast website, and I hope to meet some of you there. If you can't be there, join us for special coverage from Dramfest 2020 that weekend on WhiskeyCast. Time now for the WhiskeyCast calendar of events. Lots going on around the world of whiskey these days. If you're in the Boston area, Julio's Liquors in Westboro, Massachusetts, has its annual Go Whiskey Week this week, with events starting on Tuesday and running through Sunday, March 1st. The Bourbon Classic runs from Wednesday through Saturday in Louisville, Kentucky. The Whiskey Show Old and Rare is this coming Saturday and Sunday in London, along with the Newcastle Whiskey Festival on Saturday in Newcastle, England. Tickets are still available for the Whiskey Exchange's Ben Romick tasting March 4th in London with Michael Urquhart. Woodford Reserve has its first Bourbon Academy of the Year March 7th at the distillery in Versailles, Kentucky. The Texas Whiskey Festival is that same day at Star Hill Ranch in Austin, Texas. And the New Orleans Bourbon Festival runs from March 11th through the 14th. Right now, we have 275 different events around the world on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. Just click on the search button to find out what's happening near you or wherever you'll be traveling soon.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. February is thought of as Black History Month in the U.S., but until recently there has not been a lot of discussion about the history of African Americans in the whiskey industry. Let's be honest, though. Except for Prohibition, the subject of whiskey is rarely ever discussed in American history classes. For instance, we were never taught in school that George Washington owned one of America's largest distilleries after he served as president. Of course, we're also never told much about the fact that Washington owned slaves and that some of those slaves worked in his distillery. In fact, slave labor was responsible for a large percentage of American whiskey production through the end of the Civil War, though there are not a lot of written records left from those days. One of the former slaves we do know about, though, is Nathan Nearest Green. He was born in Maryland around 1820 or so, and eventually wound up in Lynchburg, Tennessee, working on the farm of the Reverend Daniel Call, who also employed a young white man by the name of Jasper Newton. We know him today as Jack Daniel. Call put the two men together, and the rest is history. Not only did Nearest Green teach young Jack Daniel how to make whiskey, but after the Civil War, the newly emancipated Nearest Green and his sons went to work with Jack Daniel when he opened his own distillery. Today, Nearest Green is regarded as the first head distiller in the history of Jack Daniel's, one of the world's best-selling whiskeys. Now, we have told the story before of how Fawn Weaver read a 2016 New York Times story by Clay Risen about Nearest Green and Jack Daniel. She decided to dig deeper into the history behind that story and worked with Green's descendants to create the Uncle Nearest whiskey brand. Part of the proceeds from Uncle Nearest sales go to the Nearest Green Foundation, which is already providing full college scholarships for members of the family. Now there's an even closer tie between the whiskey itself and the family. Last year, around the time the first phase of the Uncle Nearest distillery opened up in Shelbyville, Tennessee, the brand introduced a new expression, Uncle Nearest 1884 Small Batch. The idea was that members of the Green family would help pick the barrels that go into that whiskey, starting out with Victoria Eady-Butler, Nearest Green's great-great-granddaughter. Well, it turns out she's a natural blender and wound up being named the master blender for Uncle Nearest. Here's how Fawn Weaver described her at the time.
She sat in the tasting room along with a tasting panel and tasted all 30 totes. Now, we all gave our opinion. I was, of course, one of the people on the tasting panel, but none of us actually chose what would make it in. And there were some where we did not like it for one reason or another, and Victoria would say, well, I like it, and this is the reason why. And it would go in. So what is here I'm incredibly proud of, but the family, Nearest's family, is so incredibly proud of because it was truly their batch. And so I told Victoria that whiskey is clearly in her blood.
Victoria Eady-Butler had just retired after a 31-year-long career in federal law enforcement. Now she's spending a lot of time on the road, as well as in the blending lab. This week she'll be in the lab to start putting together the next batch of Uncle Nearest 1884 small batch. We sat down to talk this week in Seattle, just before an Uncle Nearest dinner.
Tell me the story of Nearest Green, the way the family told it all these years.
Well, it's basically what people know today. My grandmother was the monarch of the family, and she took every opportunity to tell her family and those who visited her on her front porch or sat at her dinner table that her grandfather was the man responsible for teaching Jack Daniel how to make whiskey. So it's never been a secret in my family, certainly, nor even in Lynchburg.
But it was a secret outside of Lynchburg until just recently, a few years ago. I mean, the distillery never denied it, but they didn't make a big deal about it either. Correct.
At one point, they did include Nearest in their story at the distillery, but for whatever reason, it went missing for a long, long time. And then Fawn Weaver came on the scene about 4 years ago when she started putting the story together. And now, not only is the story being told by the Uncle Nearest team, it's also shared for folks who visit Jack Daniel Distillery. So Nearest is definitely in their pitch, their storyline at the when you go to take a tour. And there's a tribute wall to Nearest Green's family in their welcome house at Jack Daniel.
And there are still descendants and members of your family working there.
Absolutely. Of all these years, there's never been any Jack Daniel whiskey made without a Green on the premises. And currently I have 2 sisters and a brother who are employed there.
What did your family think when Fawn Weaver started doing the research and then came to you as the family and came up with the idea for the Nearest Green Foundation in conjunction with everybody, and then the whiskey? What was the talk here of this woman coming in from California that hit Lynchburg sort of like a force of nature?
Yes, Fawn Weaver is that kind of girl. To talk to Fawn, you'll soon learn after having conversations with her that she's very authentic, transparent, genuine, and she's honest. And it doesn't take long to learn that her intent was pure and it was genuine. So the family embraced her quickly. I came along a little bit later than most because I don't live in the area and I was busy working another career. But when I met her, I knew much about her just from my siblings, and they had already embraced her. And so to sit down and have a conversation with her, you soon learn that her intent was good, and it still is.
And I would imagine after 31 years with the FBI, you develop a pretty good BS detector when you're talking to somebody, right?
Yeah, I think so. I had the privilege of working with the Regional Organized Crime Information Center and work with the FBI. I work with local law enforcement and state. So, I have a pretty good BS detector.
And you also have a really good nose for whiskey, too, as we found out when Fawn turned you loose to do the 1884 small batch.
Yeah, I do. I do. And not to be boastful, but I do have I have a knack for it. And
don't be modest. Just go for it. You're good at this.
I am good at it. I'm good at it, and I think that it truly is in my blood. It's in my lineage. What my great-great-grandfather started, I am privileged to continue on. Not as a master distiller, but as the first female African-American master blender on record.
How did you develop this skill? Was it just natural? I know you've done a lot of stuff with cocktails, but how did you develop this, or was it just all basically being a savant at it and just instantly knowing how to do this?
Yeah, I wouldn't say instantly knowing, but it did come pretty quick. I did the first small batch, and it launched in July of 2019, and the sales were phenomenal. The responses were all positive, and we started winning awards with it. And then I did the second batch and the third batch, and next week I will do the fourth batch. So yeah, it has come pretty natural to me to do this.
What did you think when Fawn said, "I want you to be the master blender"?
I was honored, a bit surprised, but certainly honored. And of course, I was thrilled that I was even honored to be the first descendant to do the 1884 small batch, and then to be elevated to the first female African American master blender. I say honored. I can't put into word what really it means to me.
This family should have a larger place, not only in Black history, but in American history, period, because of the contributions of your great-great-grandfather. And I'm just curious, what were you guys thinking all these years, knowing the contributions he'd made and knowing that it really wasn't recognized the way it should have been?
Well, we accepted it for what it was. My great-great-grandfather was a slave, and like all slaves, they weren't even considered people. So to have his work acknowledged, to have it to go unacknowledged, rather, it wasn't surprising. Now, for Jack Daniel and his family and all the people in Lynchburg, they knew and acknowledged that. Certainly Jack and his family did. You know, they had a very unique friendship. So what Nearest Green contributed to Jack Daniel did not go unnoticed to Jack Daniel and his family.
It really has sort of become, in the last couple of years here, just sort of this amazing story that people are now paying attention to, not just in the U.S., but every place this whiskey is sold, the U.K., all over.
Right. It is spreading. The news about it, the story is spreading everywhere. Just a few weeks ago, a good friend of mine sent me a text. She had received a text from a student at Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, that she was sitting in a history class and she was learning about the contributions of Nearest Green. So it is transcending the spirits industry over into just history, period. So we're thrilled about that.
Every February we celebrate Black History Month, and you see these vignettes about George Washington Carver and other historical legends of African American history. Sooner or later, they're going to have to do one of those for Nearest Green.
Absolutely. It is the job and the intent of the Uncle Nearest team to continue to pound the pavement, spread the word, have events where we share Nearest's contributions still now to those who don't know. And yeah, it's our intent that everyone, not just in the spirits industry, but everyone know Nearest's contribution to history.
Tell me about the foundation that was set up to take some of the proceeds from Uncle Nearest's sales and put his descendants through college.
Oh, yeah, we're extremely proud of the foundation. In fact, the foundation was established before the first bottle of whiskey was ever put on a shelf. So the foundation will pay for full ride for all of Nearest Green's bloodline descendants to continue their higher education, whether they opt to get their master's, their PhD, or even law school. So we're thrilled that Fawn and Keith Weaver took the initiative to start that before anything else was ever done. So the family's extremely grateful for that.
And you've already got kids benefiting from this.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we have my niece, as a matter of fact, is one of the children who has benefited. She graduates with her master's degree in May, along with several other children that have already graduated.
Got to send at least one of these kids to chemistry school or something to learn how to be a distiller at some point, I would think.
Oh, sure. At some point that will be initiated and something that we intend to make happen at the Near Screen Distillery.
Have you identified somebody in your family that you think can take over your role someday?
I wouldn't say identified, but I'm hopeful that my son or grandson come along behind me and carry on what I've started, and or one of my cousins or nieces. But yeah, I would like to see one of my relatives continue doing what I'm doing.
Let's go long term. What do you think 100 years from now? What's going to be the legacy of Nearest Green?
100 years from now, when I am gone and the distillery there in Shelbyville, Tennessee is booming, I hope that you'll be interviewing someone else who talked about the contributions that Nearest made, but you'll be doing that from a beautiful distillery in Shelbyville, Tennessee. So it is the intent when Fawn Weaver launched this brand. It was not to build out a distillery that it would go away in 2 or 3 years. The intent was to build out a distillery to cement Nearest Green's name in forever history, and that everyone would know who he is and the contributions he made to the spirits industry.
You and I are both going to be gone 100 years from now. It's going to be my grandkid that does the interviews, probably.
Absolutely. So just like me, you want someone to carry on your legacy. So 100 years from now, maybe someone in your family will be interviewing someone in my family about what's happening over there in Shelbyville, Tennessee at this beautiful distillery.
We can only hope.
While Victoria Eady-Butler was the first African-American woman to be named Master Blender for an American whiskey brand, she is not the only one now. Diageo recently named Ebony Major as the lead blender for Bullet Bourbon, and she is starting to make appearances on behalf of the brand as well. That's WhiskeyCast in Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Once again, I was in Seattle this week for the World Whisky Forum being held at Westland Distillery, and the day after the forum ended, Westland unveiled its new Coldfoot American Single Malt. It's created in collaboration with Filson, the clothing and outdoor gear maker located just down the street from the distillery. I was able to get a Coldfoot sample before I left. Edition number 1 is bottled at 50% ABV and has an aromatic nose with touches of walnuts, caramel-covered apples, and cocoa beans. The taste has those cocoa beans along with a heathery peatiness, campfire smoke, and touches of dried fruits, honey, and a hint of toffee for a well-rounded and complex flavor. The finish, long and smoky, with a hint of underlying sweetness. I'm scoring the Coldfoot American Single Malt Whiskey a 92. I mentioned High West's new High Country American Single Malt in the news a few weeks ago. It's only available at High West's distillery shops in Park City and Wanship, Utah for now, but there are plans to release it more widely in the future. High Country is 2 years old, bottled at 44% ABV, and uses 3 different malt mash bills with different levels of roasting and peatiness, along with a combination of new oak, ex-bourbon and rye barrels, and port wine casks. The nose is woody with a hint of mesquite seasoning and oak, toasted vanilla, and butterscotch. The taste is well-rounded with barley sugar maltiness, subtle touches of clove and white pepper, vanilla, and a soft oakiness. The finish is long and smooth with lingering spices, vanilla, touches of oak and mesquite, and just a hint of campfire smoke. I'm scoring High West Distillery's High Country American Single Malt a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Rye whiskey was distilled by America's original risk-takers and history makers. Those first barrels of whiskey were bold, flavorful, and full of passion. Sagamore Spirit proudly picked up the torch with their spring-fed Maryland-style rye whiskey. It celebrates the grit and glory of those patriotic ancestors who sipped their way into American history. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com to explore their award-winning spirit. I got to taste a lot of interesting whiskeys during the World Whisky Forum, including the first release of Filey Bay Single Malt from the Spirit of Yorkshire Distillery in England. It comes from barley grown by co-founder David Thompson on his farm near the distillery and is a little over 3 years old and bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is light and clean with a floral, fruity character and a touch of citrusy tartness. The taste starts off tart and citrusy, then spicier notes of clove, cinnamon, and allspice come in to round out the flavor. The finish is long and tart with lingering spices. This is Yorkshire's first ever locally produced single malt whiskey, and I'm scoring the Filey Bay first release from Spirit of Yorkshire Distillery a 91. We are starting to see more and more experimentation with finishes in casks that previously held other distilled spirits, and mezcal seems to be becoming a popular choice. I recently shared my tasting notes for Chapelgate's J.J. Corey The Battalion, which is an Irish whiskey finished in mezcal and tequila casks. This week I had the chance to taste Stauning Bastard from Denmark's Stauning Distillery. It's a 3-year-old rye whiskey finished in mezcal casks and bottled at 46.3% ABV. The nose has a nice touch of agave aroma, balanced nicely by subtle spices, vanilla, and toasted oak. The taste starts off smooth and creamy, but it's quickly followed by a burst of baking spices, along with hints of lemon, lime, agave, and dried fruits. The finish is long with subtle spices and a slight tartness. I'm scoring the Stauning Bastard a 90. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. I'm adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,800 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com. In fact, you can bookmark it to refer to the next time you're out shopping for whiskeys.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. Last week's interview with Dewar's Malt's brand ambassador and breast cancer survivor Una Green brought a lot of comments, including this email. I'm going to keep the listener's name anonymous. Having developed some of my own medical issues of late and being a whiskey enthusiast, the interview with Una Green really hit home. It was inspiring, emotional, heartfelt, and just so positive. I am making every effort to change my life and live. Most importantly, I have made a resolution to look after my health first, as I have my family to enjoy. I'm grateful to have heard this interview. thank you. Well, thank you for your email, and we're all hoping you're able to work through your own issues for the better soon. We had a similar tweet from David Torres in California. Hashtag #FCancer. Glad to know there's hope in beating this terrible disease. David included a link to his own GoFundMe campaign, where he explains his own battle with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. We're happy to report that his campaign raised its goal of $5,000 to help cover his medical expenses. David, we'll keep you and your family in our thoughts, too. Now, Chris Barrow at CK Barrow tweeted this question about one of our news stories from a year or so ago. Anyone in the know on status of TTB plans to re-regulate bottle sizes in the U.S.? Asking for a friend. As you may remember, the Treasury Department's Tax and Trade Bureau floated a proposed change in federal regulations last year that would eliminate most of the requirements for bottle sizes on whiskeys and other distilled spirits. Essentially, the proposal would set a minimum and maximum bottle size. The technical term here is standards of fill. But whiskey companies would be able to decide for themselves what actual bottle sizes to use in between. Well, the public comment period for that proposal is long over now, and it is still in the review stage at the TTB. There's no word on when a final rule change might be announced. And by the way, that's also the case for the much wider proposal from back in late 2018 that would revamp many of the other federal regulations for distilled spirits. We were tagged in an interesting comment from @BourbonScript on Twitter, and I'm just going to throw this out there to start a discussion. Funny how brands build a cult-like following, and then you blind taste them, and suddenly they score below cheaper, more obtainable expressions. Speaks to the power of marketing and secondary market hype. Well, if you have some comments on that one, send them along. If there's anything else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter @WhiskeyCast, or you can just email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label. It's our look at the history, science, and all those other things that make whiskey unique, and it's brought to you by Writer's Tears. During this week's World Whisky Forum in Seattle, one of the key points of discussion was diversity in the grain that distillers use. Since the end of World War II, agriculture has become more than just individual farmers working their fields and then taking their grain to market at harvest time. It has become a system that critics call commodity agriculture, where the goal is to get as much crop yield from a field as possible using limited varieties of grain, and to those critics, nearly unlimited amounts of fertilizers, pesticides, and other chemicals. It's a system that Dr. Stephen Jones of Washington State University walked away from. At one time, he was the state's lead wheat breeder for farmers in that commodity agriculture system. Now he heads up the university's Bread Lab plant breeding program at its Mount Vernon Research Center. His lab has a seed library with nearly 8,000 different types of barley, wheat, and other grains. By way of comparison, the industry's American Malting Barley Association has just 30 varieties of 2-row barley and 7 different 6-row barleys on its recommended list for 2020. Those varieties were selected for their grain yields, heat stress tolerance, and water demand, and not necessarily for their flavors. Here's an edited version of some of Steve Jones's comments from his presentation at the World Whisky Forum.
In 1950, there were 9 million hectares of barley in the U.S. Today, there's less than 1 million. There are fewer acres of barley planted in the U.S. in 17, 18, and 19, the lowest value since 1874. That's not 1974, it's 1874, right? Something's wrong, right? If you're super into barley, you should be worried about that figure, right? If you're super into barley, you should be like Westland and Bruichladdich and others that are super into breeding barley and developing their own barleys, right? To me, that's quite shocking. So if you look at how agriculture was until a little over 100 years ago, it was quite diverse. You've heard of land races, right? There's a lot of variation left in there. Our strategy on climate chaos is to create chaos in the field genetically. And it comes to us with changing things. We come to it with a plate of cookies or malt and say, here, try this, right? There's that much variation left in there. So one of our new varieties, our newest variety, is one that has thousands of types within it. It's not a variety, it's a population. We hear also that it takes 12 years to develop a barley variety. We're going to do it in about 4 or 5. And the way we're going to do that is when we get to the point where we like it, we give it to the growers, and it has tremendous variation in it. That creates complications for maltsters. We know that, for barley in particular, but that's why we work with maltsters like this, right, is they can deal with variation and embrace it. And I think it's really critical, and it goes with us not doing regular, right? Regular is it's all the same, it's all going to work the same. That's a commodity system, that's done. Irregular, in a positive way, is there's tremendous variation. That field of barley has 1,000 different barleys in it, and we're just going to be fine, right? That's our strategy, is to not, if you have 1 million acres of something that's all the same and you have one event, you're screwed for that whole 1 million acres. If you have a million acres and there's 1 million types there, some are going to do better than others. That's a strategy that we favor. It's old school breeding with high yield. The myth that organic cannot feed the world is not a harmless one. It is not a harmless myth. Our highest yielding wheats and barleys 2 years ago were certified organic here. We went over 200 bushels per acre. The average yield in the state of Kansas is 40, and that's conventional high input agriculture. So we work with diverse things as well. We're working with Westland and Skagit Valley Malting and farmers here to changing the way that our grains look in the field. We have diversity within a field, we have diversity across a landscape, and we have diversity in our plates and our glasses and bottles as well. So the way to deal with climate crisis in the meantime is to feed and give people something to drink that are fixing it, right? In agriculture, we're not going to fix it, I'm sorry, right? In this country, it's 9% of the climate gases are from agriculture. We're not going to fix it. Let the 91% work on it. Not saying we're ignoring it, but what we can do is make sure we get as much as we can per acre, and we do it in the most responsible way possible, as few inputs as possible. And many of those inputs are nitrogen and chemicals and things like that. So we think of nothing but that. So we've been doing organic grain breeding at our university since 1991. So we don't come late to this.
Here's an example of one of the projects Steve Jones has been working on with Westland Distillery. A couple of years ago, they took the same variety of barley and planted it in 2 specific fields. One was located as close as possible to where the Skagit River empties into the salt water of Skagit Bay, and the other is at the head end of the river near the Cascades Mountains. The barley from each field was then harvested and malted separately before being taken to Westland, where each crop was distilled the same way and put into similar casks for maturation. The idea? To gauge the impact of terroir on the final whiskey. The final grade on that project is still a few years away. We'll keep you posted. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskeycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of Whiskey Cast. We have links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskeycast.com. That is also where you'll find links for our WhiskeyCast HD videos, the WhiskeyCast Tasting Panel podcast, the latest whiskey news. my tasting notes, the calendar of events, our whiskey photo of the week, and of course, a complete archive of all of our past episodes going all the way back to 2005. We love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at WhiskeyCast, and my email address is comments@whiskeycast.com.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskeyCast.
WhiskeyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.